Hello and welcome to the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies new series, the CEAS Knowledge Café, Conversations Without Discipline. I'm Claudia Rowland, the event manager for CEAS. In this first session of the series, the conversation will be between two brilliant CEAS scholars, Dr. Philippa Hetherington and Professor Richard Mull, who will be talking on sexuality in Russia. I'd like to introduce them briefly. Philippa is a historian of gender, sexuality and law in modern Eurasia. She's been a lecturer at UCLC since 2015, where she teaches courses on 19th and 20th century Russia, the Caucasus, as well as law and empire. Currently, she is finishing a book examining the evolution of trafficking in women as a specific crime in turn of the century Russia, which she argues was central to ideas about international humanitarian law, migratory regulation and imperial governance in the period from 1880 to 1935. Her new research follows the channels of this work on law, border crossing, and the politics of gender by looking at a series of marriage crises in late imperial and early Soviet Russia, from efforts to suppress bride abduction to the legal challenge of transnational marriage for a confessional state. Early research for this project has been supported by a collaboration between UCL and the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, which has funded the research network When is Marriage Slavery? Historical and legal entanglements. When she's not writing and teaching history, Philippa likes reading feminist theory, learning Italian, and traveling to all corners of the former Soviet Union. And Richard is a political sociologist whose research focuses on the relationship between identity and power, with particular reference to nationalism, sexuality, and migration. He arrived at CEAS in 2003 as a Mellon postdoctoral research fellow and was appointed to a lectureship the following year. He has recently completed a project funded by the Humboldt Foundation on queer migration to London and Berlin, and is currently putting the finishing touches to an edited volume on queer migration and asylum in Europe, which will be published by UCL Press early next year. He is currently the principal investigator of an innovative training network on populism in Central and Eastern Europe, which received 3.5 million euros from the EU to train 15 early stage researchers. At the same time, he is director of research of Pop Rebel, a consortium of 7 partners, which has received 3 million euros from the EU to finance a range of projects on the rise of populism in Central and Eastern Europe. Richard's own research as part of this project examines the politicization of homophobia by populist political parties. In his spare time, he likes reading detective fiction, cooking Peruvian food, and learning Gaelic. We've given them the broad topic of sexuality in Russia, and we will see where this conversation takes us. So thank you to our presenters, thank you to those watching, and we hope you enjoy this celebration of interdisciplinarity. Off you go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claudia. That was a very generous introduction. And I thought, coming together to talk about sexuality in Russia and our different disciplines, we could start by talking a bit about our origin stories, or how we came to study sexuality in the region. So, Richard, tell me, how did you come to the topic of sexuality in Russia?
It was really by accident. I'd always had an interest in identities, but my sort of initial interest, sort of through my sort of undergraduate, master's, and PhD, was national identity. So I really focused on nationalism. And when I arrived at CEAS, my main research and teaching focused specifically on nationalism and ethnic conflict. But at the time, a friend and colleague of mine, Claire Thompson, had taken over the convenership of the Gender Studies MA. And she had asked if I would contribute a lecture on nationalism and gender and sexuality. I told her that I'd never studied this relationship before. I wasn't familiar with the literature, but that I'm sure I could perhaps knock something together for an hour's lecture. And so I started reading the literature, and I started actually with work by a colleague of ours, Wendy Bracewell, who wrote 2 excellent articles on masculinity and national identity, and the role of women in the nation, both with reference to Serbia and Kosovo. And this sort of led to sort of other works on the relationship between nationalism and gender and sexuality. And I just got hooked. And from then on, my research, which previously looked at sort of foreign policy, security policy, shifted towards the study of gender and sexuality, although initially with particular reference to the relationship between nationalism. And so the first research I did in this field didn't relate to Russia per se, but rather to Latvia. although the Soviet influence and the Russian influence was still felt. Because at that time, the Eurobarometer series had just published one of its research reports on homophobia in Central and Eastern Europe. No, actually, it was homophobia within the EU as a whole. And of all of the member states at the time, Latvia was bottom in terms of support for LGBT equality. And so that was something I wanted to understand, because the usual reasons for homophobia sort of religion, and Latvia is actually sort of quite a secular state. Very few people profess to being practicing Christians. And so I sort of wanted to understand why homophobia was particularly strong there. And analysing political speeches, political discourse, the main argument seemed to be sort of nationalism. That so when Latvia became an independent state in 1991, Latvians only constituted about 52% of the population. And so there was this discourse that our nation is going to die out. We're going to be overrun with Russians and other Russian speakers. Therefore, it's essential that we safeguard our nation. And so LGBT people were constructed as not contributing towards the nation. This idea that gays and lesbians don't have children, that they don't contribute to the construction of the family, which is seen as the most important unit in the Latvian nation. And so this was my first foray into research looking at sexuality in the post-Soviet space. Initially, I did focus on the Baltic states, but as events unfolded in Russia, particularly the third presidency of President Putin, when homophobia became increasingly politicized. This is when my attention was drawn more to what was going on in Russia. And since then, Russia has been one of my main sort of geographical area of interest. Mm-hmm. And what about yourself, Philippa? How did you come to be interested in this topic?
So I mean, that's really interesting, because I can see how your journey towards the study of sexuality is very organic. And I feel like maybe mine was a bit less organic, in the sense that, I mean, it does start from kind of the beginning, though, in that I was interested in sexuality and Russian history kind of from my undergraduate days. And I was majoring in undergraduate in Russian language and history. And so understandably, I kind of gravitated towards Russian history classes, which was how I ended up becoming a Russian historian. And in my very first Russian, sort of this first survey I took of like modern Russian history, I wrote an essay on sexuality in Fantasiac Russia, and read for that essay a book from the early 90s called The Keys to Happiness, Sex and the Search for Modernity in Fantasiac Russia by the historian Laura Engelstein. And as the title suggests, this is about how certain kinds of concerns about hopes for, plans for, anxieties about modernity in turn of the century Russia were framed through and understood through discussions about sexuality in different kinds of ways. And I was essentially kind of hooked from that book. I really loved the book, and it was, and for that essay and following kind of the questions that opened up, I actually started reading quite a lot of more literary studies about Fantasiac Russia, sexuality in Fantasiac Russia, and discovered that turn of the century Russian literature is just kind of swathed in questions about sex and about gender and about the boundaries of the normative in those different realms, and how to overcome and transgress the boundaries of the normative in those different realms. And I became really interested in those things. So sort of from the beginning, in a way that makes me feel sort of boring, because I got interested in this when I was 19, basically, and have just kind of continued from then, even with the same time period. I also got absolutely hooked on the Fantasiac period, the sort of 20 years before and 20 years after 1900, basically. And kind of continued on from there. The interesting thing, and maybe this is something we can talk about a bit later, is despite the fact that was kind of the thing that hooked me from the beginning, at least in the history discipline, sexuality is not really a particularly developed, or the study of sexuality is not really a particularly developed field in the Russia field. In history of sexuality as a subfield of the history discipline is very developed, has lots of journals, has all sorts of sophisticated methodological and theoretical discussions and debates about how best to study sexuality, how to historicize it, how to think about it. Very influenced by, Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which sort of, in a way, set up from the kind of 80s the study of sexuality as a deeply historical question or problem because of Foucault's genealogical method. So I think history of sexuality within the discipline is very much a well-developed field. In the Russia field, not so much. So I think I kind of got the wrong impression by reading Laura Engelstein's book, which had been very deservedly fated in the field. And I thought, oh yeah, this is the kind of thing I can really dig into, and then discovered that almost no one else wrote about this. There are a few people, but even I would say, this is something that I've been interested in, and I've since, having met Professor Engelstein since, asked her about and talked to her about, which is that people kind of took up from her book the arguments she was making about, for example, liberalism and the failures of liberalism in early 20th century Russia, about mass politics, which she argued in that book were viewed through this prism of sexuality, but they didn't necessarily take up her findings in order to think more about sexuality in Russia. They took them up in order to think more about liberalism, governance, again, modernity. And so as a result, when I got to graduate school to do my PhD, I found myself working in, and knowing that I wanted to work on sexuality, although I did my PhD in America. So there you don't have to have a specific research topic when you arrive at graduate school. You have to have pretty good ideas about the kinds of things you're interested in, but you don't need a question written down on a piece of paper. This is exactly the question I'm going to answer, because you have 2 years of coursework before you actually have to go and start writing your thesis. So I came knowing I wanted to work on sexuality in fantasy Russia. But I suddenly discovered, learning a lot more about the field, that it was not something that many other people did. So I had to sort of think about how to fit in various other interests that I developed in graduate school to do with questions about legal history, about everyday life under Stalin, various other topics that I became equally enthralled by, and think about how to trace this thread of gender and sexuality and this interest that I developed as an undergraduate through those kinds of topics. And that's how I ended up working on this question of trafficking in women at the Fantasy. So with that, I have kind of this topic of my PhD and of my first book, I have kind of a fun origin story, which is that I went to the archives for the first time in the former Soviet Union. I actually went to Odessa, now in southern Ukraine, which was one of the largest cities in late imperial Russia. And I knew that I wanted to work on sexuality. And at the time, I had a vague idea. This was the first summer after my first year of my PhD, when I was mostly doing coursework and preparing for my oral exams. And I had a vague idea that I might want to write my PhD dissertation about kind of urbanization and sexuality, and the idea of kind of public sexuality. So sex in public in Odessa, this very important port city, which was also known in the Russian Empire for being this very cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, kind of on the very modern city. So thinking about how, again, ideas about, say, multi-ethnicity, cosmopolitanism, empire were being refracted through concerns about or celebrations of sex in public. This was the idea I went working with. And what I sort of thought, I didn't want to specifically write necessarily about just about prostitution, but thinking about public sex and concerns about public sex, the kind of most direct way, or the most obvious starting point, the lowest hanging fruit, I thought for that would be thinking about discussions about and regulation of prostitution in Odessa in kind of the late 19th and early 20th century. But I was warned by people who had more experience than me with the Russian archives that was not really a topic that would strike archivists in Russia or Ukraine as necessarily an appropriate topic, or maybe necessarily a serious topic. It wouldn't lead them to take me seriously necessarily. And in the archives in Russia, or this was actually in Ukraine, so I would say in former Soviet Union, I should say, when you go, you often have to have, especially maybe in more provincial archives, so outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, you often have a one-on-one interview with one of the archivists where you tell them about your tema, your topic, and they give you some advice and thoughts on where you might go looking for material in which particular collections. And so I had come up with this roundabout way to try and think about how to describe what I wanted to study, what I was looking for. And so I went in and I had my interview with Lilia Grigorievna at the Odessa archive, ready to sort of say to her, okay, I'm interested in histories of women. I'm interested in histories of women who work and women who worked maybe in informal and irregular work. And I kind of said this to her, and she sort of kept pressing me. She's like, what do you mean by informal and irregular work? Do you mean in a factory? I was like, no, not in a factory. And she's like, are you thinking of domestic service? And I was like, no, not domestic service. And then finally she was like, oh, you're thinking of prostitution? I was like, I guess so, yeah. And she's like, oh, great, we have tons of stuff on that. We're just like, no one ever wants to look at it, and we're just drowning in material on it. So it was really wonderful. She put me in all sorts of really fruitful directions. And then she was the person who first brought me a file on the question of trafficking. So she's like, actually, we have all of these files on prosecutions of primarily Russian subjects who spent time in the Ottoman Empire and were coming back through Odessa. Prosecutions of them for trafficking in women for prostitution. Would you be interested in that? And that was kind of the beginning of what then became my project, and what is now I'm finishing up my book.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
You said at the time you were doing your studies and research that sexuality wasn't, or sexuality in Russia wasn't a subject that many historians dealt with. Is that still the case, or is it becoming increasingly popular?
I mean, I think it is probably still the case. I think that it's hard for me to tell because, of course, now as one of the people who does work on sexuality in Russia, I know a lot of people who are my colleagues and friends who work on histories of sexuality in Russia. So for a while, I felt like it was something that more people were doing. And then I thought maybe actually it's just that I now know all the people that do it. There are some, amazing scholars that do really great and productive work on it. Thinking of someone like Dan Healy, who's at Oxford, who wrote Homosexuality in Revolutionary Russia, which has been really productive as well for, I would say, like a bunch of younger scholars who've gone on to kind of pick up all sorts of directions that he touched on there and look into in more detail. There's, again, quite a lot of work that's come out of literature and literary studies. There's a fair amount of, probably I would say in a way the most studied thing actually is history of prostitution, which I don't specifically do myself, but I do this question of trafficking for prostitution, so it's adjacent related. And there are a few of us who do that now. But I would say still probably compared to some other subfields, it's not kind of had its moment yet. I mean, I would definitely say, for example, that the formation of the QASIS, the Queer ASIS Studies Network, with the, I always get the acronym wrong, but Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, our big area studies organization. The presence and the visibility of QASIS has been really good for, I think, helping people who do work on histories of sexuality find one another and see what each other is doing. I have wondered in the past why this is. I certainly would say, I think possibly I'm also influenced by the fact that as my work has developed, I've actually come to be particularly interested in questions of sexuality and empire. So I think, and when I say empire, my research tends to continue into the early decades of the Soviet Union. So I always think of the early Soviet Union as well. I don't claim the Soviet Union was necessarily an empire or like get involved in that debate necessarily, but thinking about, in the Russian case, sort of the the understanding and management of difference that is implicated in the imperial project and arguably continues into the early Soviet decades, how that was something that was very much entangled with ideas about sexuality. And that's something that I think is a really developed field in the case of the British Empire, the French Empire, in these historiographies. And it's something I think we don't think about that much in the Russian case. There's only a few scholars working specifically on questions of empire who think about sexuality. So, I mean, that's something I'm hoping to change with my work. But yeah, I have pondered why I think that is. And I mean, I'd be interested in your take on this as well, and if sexuality is something that is more studied in the Russian case in sociology. But I would say that in the history case, I think it's sort of two things. One is that in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and then the archives became more open for a while, there was this famed archival revolution in the Russian history field where everyone got really excited about this archival material they had not previously been able to see, especially probably about the early Soviet period. But also archival material that had at the very least been harder to access about the imperial period as well. And that led to a kind of focus on, I don't necessarily want to say empiricism, but a focus on like really getting as much out of the archive as possible. And I would say that histories of sexuality, especially as they've developed in the 80s and 90s, have really emphasized reading against the archival grain. So they've really sort of emphasized like, sure, archives are great and they're important, but it's not that the archives are, they sort of resist the idea that the archives are a treasure trove that you go and you find information. It's sort of all about like, oh, maybe you take, sexuality can be hard to find in the archive. And so you might take a snippet of something and then read it in 5 different ways to think about what this might tell us about sexuality. And I think that kind of work was not popular in the Russian field for understandable reasons in the 90s and early 2000s when everyone wanted to get as much material out of the archives as they could. So that's one. On the one hand, the other thing is that I think within Russia itself, historians, perhaps for political reasons and institutional reasons, sexuality and sexuality studies have not had a chance to flourish maybe as much within the Russian academy as outside it. And that means that there's certainly, again, people who do history of sexuality within the Russian academy now, but there maybe weren't so many 20 years ago. And so the kinds of questions that were being asked by Russian historians of Russia weren't necessarily these ones about, or that were so engaged with like queer theory and things like that. But how about in sociology? Is it something that you feel is a developed kind of subfield?
I mean, the sociology of sexuality is absolutely a subfield. The specific focus on Russia, perhaps we could call it a subfield. But it's interesting that you mentioned queer at Assis, because I think this has helped to bring together a lot of scholars working sort of within the same disciplinary field. So sociologists of sexuality looking specifically at Russia. And so you do get more of a sense that there is a sort of a critical mass to the extent that we could call ourselves a particular subfield, or at least a defined field of research. And one of the things that Tatiana, who has been organizing Queer at Assis, has done was to ask for different syllabi, those of us teaching sexuality in Russia. And so so historians have submitted their the syllabuses they use, social scientists, and so you do get a sense also that there is a sort of a body of work that students interested in sexuality in Russia can sort of absorb in order to sort of have a better sense of the field. Whereas previously, I mean, when I first started teaching sexuality in Eastern Europe, it would trying to find enough references, specifically in the field of social science, to populate a 1-page on the sociology of sexuality in Eastern Europe. Not even sort of just focusing on Russia, but on Eastern Europe was a bit of a struggle. Whereas every year that I'm updating my own syllabus, it becomes easier and easier because the amount of research being conducted is ever expanding.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I mean, with social science, a lot of the research we do is prompted by sort of current events, so trying to explain what's going on. And so, in that sense, what's going on in Russia, the anti-gay propaganda law prompted a lot of research. Why has this been introduced? Why is it so widely supported in Russia? And then similarly, what's going on in Poland now? This will also sort of prompt, you're sort of seeing it in sort of very quick off the mark blog posts, sort of opinion pieces, and this will further develop, I'm very sure, into a sort of a greater analysis of the situation in Poland, particularly with reference to sort of homosexuality, homophobia, and populism, and the far right. Why these sort of LGBT-free zones again are sort of supported by a significant population, percentage of the population in Poland. Whereas in other sort of Central and East European countries, such as the Czech Republic, which has its own sort of brand of populism, populist actors certainly have influence there. There, homosexuality and homophobia simply isn't a topic in the same way that it is in Poland. And so it's sort of trying to understand why these sort of neighboring countries that were formerly part of the so-called Soviet Empire have sort of such different understandings of homosexuality, why it's a sort of a useful tool for whipping up support among the population in one country, but not in another. Mm-hmm. And then even sort of going, it's not, to take those two examples and adding a third, the former East Germany, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which is the strongest populist party there, initially was actually campaigning for the gay vote. They were sort of using sort of homo-nationalist arguments that, we're the only ones who can keep the Muslims out, and the Muslims, they're the ones who should really be worried about. So it was very sort of interesting the way that different populist parties were sort of instrumentalizing homophobia or not, but sort of in very different ways in order to sort of meet the political aims of their sort of own constituencies. Mm-hmm. And this was sort of something that, as a political sociologist, I found fascinating. And I sort of went back to the history books and sort of looked at how the Soviet Union sort of did the same, because the Soviet Union is a really sort of interesting, paradoxical example, because, in 1917, the new Soviet Russian regime was only the second major power in the world to decriminalize homosexual acts between men after France. Right. And then, less than 20 years later, it was recriminalized, and then the Soviet Union introduced one of the most repressive anti-gay regimes in the country, in the world. And then it was decriminalized again by Yeltsin as a sign of, we're properly European, so please let us join the Council of Europe. And then it's becoming increasingly, not sort of recriminalized, but certainly the legal apparatus has been used to sort of limit the rights and the expression of LGBT Russians under Putin. And so it's this sort of constant sort of ebb and flow of sort of expanding rights and then sort of clawing them back, and sort of looking at the motivations for this, and how are they legitimized, what political and social aims are they seeking to achieve by sort of either sort of promoting or clawing back rights for LGBT people. And this is, I think, sort of one of the key themes, certainly in sociology, at least sort of political sociology, around which a sort of a more defined sort of field of research with specific reference to Russia is developing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And is that something that you see? I mean, I know that as we know, the political situation and again, institutional situation on the ground can make it difficult. But in Russia and maybe other former Soviet countries, do you see sexuality as a key subfield in sociology there, like in the research that's being done by scholars in Russia or in Ukraine or in Latvia, etc.?
In Russia, it's becoming more difficult. to do that sort of research, I think. And there's certainly no shortage of very good Russian scholars working on this topic, but a number of them have now sort of left Russia and have taken up positions in other European countries, which makes it much easier for them to sort of pursue their research. And so they're still conducting research about sexuality in Russia, but sort of outside of Russia. And I think, I mean, that sort of influences also the choice of research I've done. My most recent research has been about queer Russian migrants and asylum seekers. And so this means that the queer Russians come to me rather than me having to go to Russia, because conducting sort of queer related research on the ground in Russia would be more difficult. I mean, in the archives, correct me if I'm wrong, but it may be you have an advantage that, you're working on your own with the material, once you get past the gatekeeper. Whereas if I were sort of interviewing sort of activists or LGBT individuals, this makes it potentially sort of difficult and dangerous for them if their sexuality becomes sort of public knowledge. I mean, I myself have had trouble sort of, I presented my research on this topic in Serbia a couple of years ago, and it was sort of widely advertised on the university website. And after I spoke for about 10 minutes, a group of young men with big boots and very short haircuts came in, stood between me and the audience, unplugged all my PowerPoints, told me to leave, that I mean, they were shouting very loudly in Serbian, which I don't speak, but I got the gist. And afterwards, the organizers sort of explained that, again, it was this sort of idea that comes up again and again, that sort of homosexuality is a Western issue and that I'm trying to sort of promote it within their much more traditional society. So
of the exact things you now study about to do with activism and yeah.
Exactly, yes. So studying homosexuality in societies which are very traditional is sort of problematic. But there is absolutely no shortage of researchers who do this and do it extremely well. It's just that they don't do it in Russia to the same extent that they used to. Is that true in history as well? Are there Russian historians in Russia?
There definitely are Russian historians in Russia that work on history of sexuality, and you are right. I think in some ways in the archives we have, working with archives, we have the benefit that although there is the gatekeeper function of the archivist, sometimes, again, my experience in Odessa was the opposite of a gatekeeper. I was very a very generous archivist who essentially helped me find the topic of my book. But and I've actually never had a problem. Working on things to do with prostitution, I guess, the issue is maybe that it might be seen as unscholarly, less than it might be seen as problematic politically, maybe. I think I have at different points in time in archives in Russia and outside Russia encountered like raised eyebrows, but not. I've never felt like I was being blocked from having access to material or anything like that at all. And I think that is mostly the experience of researchers, but my friends who are researchers of and colleagues who are researchers of sexuality within Russia who work in Russia. I think it's harder if you work on homosexuality. Definitely for people to even, but again, if something's in the finding aid and it's written there, you request it. I haven't heard from people saying that they felt that things were being, redacted from the finding aid. Certain files in Russian archives are closed. Certain files in British archives get closed for political reasons, and they do in Russia as well. But so far, that, to my knowledge, has not affected people working even on homosexuality. It's sort of like the political closing. It's much more going to be about things to do Gulag and terror and the war and that kind of thing, where for political reasons things will be covered up. So I think the impression I get is maybe more that there's not a huge amount of support for it institutionally as a subfield at the moment within Russia, which again, that's not to say there is none. There's definitely some, and there's amazing work that's done by scholars there, but maybe similarly often some of the people working on sexuality in Russia in a historical context end up leaving and end up working outside of Russia, or their careers maybe flourish a bit more when they do leave, because it's more of an institutionalized, kind of recognized field of study.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, thinking about that also makes me think, and this is something that I've pondered in the past as a historian, again, interested in questions of sexuality and empire, and therefore interested in talking to scholars who work on sexuality and empire in a British context or a French context or an Ottoman context, etc., is the question of what Russia, the study of Russia specifically, then brings to the broader field of the study of sexuality. So do you have thoughts on what Russia, like what looking at political sociology and sexuality in Russia brings to the broader study of sexuality in the sociological field?
Mm-hmm. I mean, so it goes back to what I was saying about the often very rapid changes in the legal position, the social position, social attitudes towards LGBT people in Russia. And so the Russian example, sort of including the Soviet example, just illustrates extremely well the way that the sort of meaning attached to homosexuality is socially constructed, the way that sort of politicians can intervene to attach very specific meaning to homosexuality, and to demonstrate that it is instrumentalized, that people do use homophobia as a tool in sort of furthering their own social and political aims. This was as true under Stalin as it is under Putin. Not to, obviously I'm not drawing a direct equivalence, but the way that they sort of instrumentalize for the political purposes of their current era is equivalent. And so in that sense, Russia, not only Russia, but Russia is a very good sort of case study in that sense of sort of looking at the social construction of sexuality. That equally sort of good examples elsewhere, but for those of us studying Eastern Europe, Russia is a sort of a very, very good example of sort of identifying these different sort of peaks and flows of social acceptance, of sort of legal equality, and then sort of marginalization. Mm-hmm. And what about for historians?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way very similar. I think that again, looking at the Soviet case is very instructive for thinking about how in a comparatively short amount of time, ideas about what constitutes acceptable versus transgressive sexual behavior can, change rapidly and cycle through different kinds of approaches. I mean, I think that to me, and again, I work on late imperial and early Soviet, but thinking about the Soviet case specifically now, for the study of gender as well, and sort of gender and sexuality together, the Soviet case is so interesting and instructive because of the kinds of opportunities for kind of, I guess, utopian thinking about remaking what constitutes normal and transgressive that come with 1917, and then the playing out of the dynamics of those ideas over the course. And again, not saying that the whole of Soviet history is just, I'll be told off by my friends who work on the mid-Soviet period and say that, it's not, they're not even thinking about 1917 then. So I'm not claiming that it all goes back to 1917, but I think with gender, with sexuality, with questions about nation, national difference, race, these different kinds of categories, there's a certain kind of utopian thinking that is happening at the beginning of the Soviet project that contains within it certain kinds of contradictions to do with, for example, if we take ideas about marriage and the family, for example, which of course are very much central to the way that normative ideas about sexuality are thought through. You have kind of utopian ideas about the family that involve, at the beginning of the Soviet kind of project, that involve thinking about breaking away from an idea that roles are biologically determined, that there's a female role and a male role, and sort of breaking open the idea of what constitutes female, male in a family, what constitutes a family, what is therefore the kind of normative sexual order. And at the same time, you have a kind of modernizing project with the Soviet Union that is predicated on certain kinds of, I would say, pan-European ideas about modernity that require a stable mother figure, a stable father figure, a stable male worker, and that kind of thing. And there are Soviet versions of that mean that you have the stable female worker in the Soviet Union as well. But there's a way in which the kind of Soviet modernity project is not actually able to be reconciled with some of the more utopian visions in terms of sexuality, gender, nationality, etc., that you have people talking about at the very beginning. So I think that is a really, in terms of how we think about historically about the possibilities that people have imagined for changing the gender order, the sexual order, I think the Soviet Union is a really instructive case. And then the other thing, kind of, I guess, more broadly that I think makes Russia really useful is that, at least in the case of, in the historical discipline and in histories of sexuality across different geographic contexts, at least in the modern period, this is, I'm excluding all of the historians who come before 1800, so I apologize to them. But if we think about like modern histories of sexuality, I would say that the field is really dominated by a kind of split between, I guess you could call it sort of metropole and colony. So in other words, a split between studying, and this is to do with the importance of histories of empire for the history of sexuality. So split between studying sexuality as a project of European imperial powers that is being worked out both at home and through their imperial expansion abroad, and the study of sexuality in places that were subject to that imperial expansion, and thinking about how that differs from, was influenced by, was produced by the very project of colonialism. And Russia, although I consider Russia to be a colonial power in many ways, and certainly as an empire, Russia doesn't fit in some ways in either of those two categories in terms of how we think about it in global history. So this is where you get the notion of the second world in the Soviet period, right? So you have like first world, third world, and then you have this second world. And that's true as well if we think about it in the 19th century as well. We wouldn't talk about first world, third world, second world in the 19th century, but we might, world systems theorists type people might talk about like semi-peripheral powers and things like that. So Russia, maybe alongside Latin America, is this region that is like kind of both subject to certain kinds of civilizational hierarchies and imposes them on other people, and doesn't quite fit into either of these two main categories where a lot of the scholarship focuses. And so I think that thinking about all sorts of topics through Russia, I think is really instructive for that reason. And certainly sexuality is another one of those. Ideas about sexuality are very influenced in Russia in, say, the 19th century by ideas coming out of Western Europe. In some ways, we could see Russia as a place that is as much or more influenced by ideas from the outside as it is influencing other places, although part of my own research is about how thinkers and writers in Russia have their own ideas about sexuality that are not the same as those in the West, but certainly they're heavily influenced by them. But the imperial project in Russia, the imperial expansion into, say, the Caucasus and Central Asia, settler colonialism in Siberia and again in Central Asia, is a project that is very much predicated on certain hierarchical ideas that are worked out through sexuality, ideas about miscegenation, ideas about, preventing racial mixing or interethnic mixing by decreeing correct forms of family organization, correct forms of sexual life. So it fits into both those categories in ways that I think can make it really interesting and instructive for global histories of sexuality and how we understand how that unfolds over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, sort of in general. I had a question that popped into my head before, Richard, while you actually at the very beginning, while you were talking about how you came to the topic, and that was about methodology. I was wondering, so you started as with nation and nationalism and national identity as your main focus, and then you moved to sexuality. So did you find that you had to change methodologies? Did you have to pick up new methodological tools in order to shift that thematic focus?
Not really, because I treated both sort of nationalism and sort of sexuality in terms of the sort of as identities. A lot of the sort of the methodological tools I used to study national identity, I then used to study sexual identities. So my PhD was based on sort of discursive approaches, social constructivism, and so I used these also when it came to the study of sexuality. And what I needed to do was more to sort of familiarize myself with the literature, to make sure that I wasn't simply repeating what had already been done. And so that took sort of more of the time, sort of reading, sort of, as you said, reading the Foucault, reading Laura Engelstein, reading Dan Healy, and sort of making sure that what I wrote was in its sort of proper historical context and theoretical context. I felt I sort of needed to also embrace or sort of become much more familiar with theories of sexuality. So in addition to Foucault, so before that, the sort of the early sexologists, and then the sort of the more recent queer theorists. And so that sort of took some time. But in terms of the actual method, that didn't really change. The sort of the epistemological approach remained the same. My sort of ontological position remained the same, and most of the tools were the same. It was more these very specific theories and the historical and social context of my areas of study that I needed to develop. And when I was studying foreign policy, a lot of it was sort of text-based, sort of analyzing policies, speeches. Whereas when I came to study sexuality, I was sort of interested at the sort of the top-down level, the way that sexuality was constructed by different political regimes, how it related to different political ideologies. But then I was also equally, if not more, interested in the lived experience of LGBT Russians and other nationalities. So for that, I needed to draw more heavily on interviewing skills. I had sort of done some interviews as part of my PhD, but they were not sort of the actual center. Most of my data didn't come from that. Whereas with the research I did on queer migrants, it was almost entirely based on the lived experiences, the narratives of LGBT Russians. To what extent did these different sort of discourses coming from on high influence the way they thought about themselves, the way that they sort of interacted with other people, the way that they were observed. And so that was, well, not necessarily a new method, it was certainly a method that I had to engage with more robustly. And then it was almost sort of accidentally that when I was sort of doing my research on queer Russian migrants in Berlin, I was invited to a number of events, and I, as a result, I dipped my toe in the water of sort of more anthropological participant observation research. So I would sort of look at it was a group called Kvartira, which is an organization in Germany for LGBT Russians and Russian speakers. And they meet every couple of weeks and they organize events, they do sort of activism. So that sort of introduced me to more participant observation methodology. So I would initially sort of sit at the back and sort of look at the way that they sort of interacted with each other, who took on what tasks, how did they decide which was the issue that they would focus on, was there sort of a hierarchy of interests? And then over time, as they got to know me, I sort of moved my chair further forward, and then it became more sort of observer participation. I was sort of invited to to sort of man the stalls at various events, to sort of take part in various sort of protests, and so this was a sort of a very much a new form of research for me, and one that I found very rewarding, because then you're not sort of sitting down with a script, you know, tell me why you moved from Moscow to Berlin and this sort of thing. It was more the sort of the chance conversations you'd have over a cup of tea while you're sort of waiting for the next event to happen, and so this opened up a new methodological avenue for me, and it was something that I've tried to sort of develop over time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, historians expected to draw on different methodologies like that, or is the archive everything?
I mean, that's a very good question. I feel like historians, we always joke that when you get to that bit of like a grant application where they ask you about methodology, historians always just kind of their brain explodes and I don't know, I'll go to the archive and read things and then I will write it down. I think probably an easier way, and I've often thought this is often the approach I take when filling out the methodology section of a grant application, is I think about it more in terms of sources. So what kinds of, because historians definitely think about what kinds of different sources and the different essentially kind of reading methodologies that are required of different kinds of sources. I mean, you can of course have oral history, but I work on periods too long ago for that to work. But I do certainly have to think about you know, archival sources, and not entirely, but I would say primarily the ones I use anyway, produced by state and government officials, or officials of different kinds of semi-public, semi-private institutions. The kind of reading strategies you develop for that are quite different to what you might use when reading a newspaper or reading someone's diary, for example, or reading someone's memoir. In my case, I started possibly influenced by the fact that, again, as an undergraduate, I had become very interested in sexuality and literature in Russian culture. I started very much self-defining as a cultural historian who was primarily interested in questions of representation and thinking about the kind of meanings that different kinds of representations produce, how people then create new understandings and new meanings via that cultural process. So very interested in things like the popular press, reading diaries and memoirs, visual sources. I kind of did a bit of a 180 when I was then researching my PhD and my book, and I think I didn't realize how much of a 180 I had done until I've been finalizing my current book manuscript and realizing how few images are in it, because I got very interested in and sort of turned into a legal historian, and you can absolutely do a representative legal history, but that's not what I did. I did get really sucked in by the archive. You know, having said that, maybe one of the reasons that sexuality is less studied in the Russia field than others is because of Russian historians' obsession with the archive. I am a fully fledged archival obsessive, like a definite, I'm 100% one of those people that loves to run in and get my hands dirty in the archive. And so once I got into the archive and realized how great it was and fascinating it was, I think I stopped thinking about kind of cultural representation as much. Again, even though one can absolutely do a cultural representative history of using entirely archival sources, the people who wrote and produced archival sources are also always representing things. You know, they're always, they're not kind of conduits to truth, and that's something that I try and think about a lot. What I tend to think I do now is I take the insights from cultural history, especially as it developed in the 90s and maybe early 2000s, and apply them to what might be seen as not necessarily cultural history sources, like say interviews that are police interviews that have been done of suspected traffickers in women, say, or of suspected victims. So I have a chapter in my forthcoming book, when it's finally finished, about the question of trafficking between Odessa and Istanbul in the last decades of the Russian Empire. And one of my kind of favorite archival sources that I found, or one of the most fruitful, has been in the Imperial Foreign Policy Archive in Moscow. And it was the proceedings of a consular commission into the question of trafficking in women that the Russian consulate in Istanbul carried out around 1910, where they went into brothels in Istanbul and found Russian women working in the brothels and interviewed them, about 80 women. So you have this collection of interviews that essentially embassy officials have made with Russian women, actually about 50% Russian Jewish women and 50% Russian Slavic women, roughly, and talking to them about how they ended up there and if they would like the embassy to help them go home and like that kind of thing. What I try and do is use the kind of insights from cultural history about how people produce meaning to think about those sources, not so much as kind of transparent documents telling me the truth about how women ended up in brothels in Istanbul, or how many the embassy managed to send back to Russia, even though all of those are important things, but to think more about things like how women are representing their life experiences and how embassy officials are understanding, or I argue misunderstanding, the kinds of representations that these women are engaged in. So that's, I would say, the kind of methodological or maybe more source-based journey I think I've been on with my research, sort of away from sources that we might see as classic representation sources, like away from thinking about how is trafficking represented in literature or how is it represented in film, towards thinking about how can we think about representation through consular interviews that you then find in the Foreign Policy Archive. All of that said, coming to the end of my project now, one of the things I've decided is that it does not have enough discussions of how trafficking is represented in literature or film. So one of the things I'm trying to do now as I finish is bring a lot more of that back in, which is kind of a fun part of the project because it means I'm sort of immersing myself back into fin de siècle literature and early Russian film and all of those really, really fun topics. Well, I think this has been really interesting, Richard. And just, I feel like whenever I talk to you about these things, which we've of course done before, I get so many like new ideas for, first of all, interesting things that we could organize together, and second of all, interesting research agendas and directions. And thinking about my next project, which again, as Claudia mentioned at the beginning, I'm interested in this question of marriage problems or marriage crises, essentially the question of which forms or organizations of marriage come to be framed as deviant or transgressive in the Russian Empire and the early Soviet Union. That of course links to questions about how contemporary debates about same-sex marriage in the region, and about how and why certain populist politicians and others frame what a normal marriage is versus a not normal marriage, and how arguably, if one looks historically, one can see that there is no such thing as a normal marriage. And even in the last 200 years, understandings of what a normal marriage is have changed enormously. So perhaps that's something we can throw back.
Absolutely. I mean, because every year for the past 10 years, it seems, there have been either sort of popular initiatives or sort of imposed initiatives to define marriage as a union between a man and a woman, with Russia obviously being the most recent. Right. Yes, and the impact of this on any other form of sort of cohabitation or intimate relationship as automatically second class is very sort of concerning. So absolutely, this is something that I'd be certainly interested in discussing with you further. Yeah.
That's great.
So thank you for organising this. Gets us out of our bubbles.
Yeah.
Gets our brains thinking again. Which is
Fun.
thank you.
And thank you both for that very interesting discussion. I think we all nearly lost time there listening to it. So thank you very much, and hope that it was helpful. It sounds like it was.
Yeah, it was really great.
Absolutely.
It was great. And it's as Richard, as you're saying, it's fun to get out of our bubble and think about these big questions as well.
Great.
Okay, so thank you for listening, everyone watching. Watch out for more of these coming soon across the week.